Hi, so this is from a project that I did last semester on Costa Rica's environmental sustainability, specifically in regards to their energy and ecotourism industries. If you don't know, Costa Rica projects itself to the outside world as one of the most environmentally sustainable countries in the world. They don't have a military, which was abolished in the 1950s, and the government has taken that money that would have gone into the military and invested it into public works, for example, renewable energy. 98% of their power now comes from renewable energy. But what I'd like to look at for this project is how the environmental policy of Costa Rica differs from that of similar developing countries that have highly centralized economies. In particular, I think Cuba would be of interest. Looking at this chart of renewable energy in Costa Rica, we can see how the governmental system of Costa Rica has influenced its investments. Um, what would make the most sense for an area around the equator like Costa Rica would be to invest in solar energy, but instead the government chose to invest in hydroelectric. A lot of people believe that this is because hydroelectric power is easier for the government to maintain a monopoly on. They have fixed points with dams rather than hundreds of solar panels which might be owned by individuals. So that's how an example of Costa Rica's government influencing the specific types of environmental policy it's enacted. Cuba would be an even more extreme example of that, right? Because Costa Rica is a democracy, Cuba debatably isn't. It really isn't. Uh, but it's still dedicated to meeting these environmental goals. And how much of that is brought on by being loosely a dictatorship, and how much of that is brought on by um, it being cut off from the outside world, right? It's been forced to be self-sustaining without the United States to trade with in other countries. The types of policies that people invest in are also influenced by the economic systems of those countries. For example, in the ecotourism industry of Costa Rica is, despite having a lot of socialist leaders, a capitalist economy driven by private businesses. So their environmental policy involves giving certificates to businesses that are environmentally friendly, um, money to landowners that meet certain biodiversity conservation criteria or reforest a certain amount of land. Cuba, on the other hand, has very few privately owned businesses, just a couple outside investors, a couple family-owned restaurants. In general, almost everything is controlled by the state. So I'd like to look at what makes their environmental policy different in regards to their economic systems and the effectiveness of those policies. For example, in Costa Rica, investing in this ecotourism industry has brought in a huge amount of money into the country. Um, the ecotourism industry has revitalized a lot of their agricultural exports, but it hasn't necessarily resulted in a better standard of living for people in rural areas. Businesses come in, they develop, they raise people's incomes, but sometimes the influx of new income makes the standard of living rise higher than people's incomes. And as a result, a lot of people are worse off. And they're no longer investing in um, industrializing skills. They're investing in a business rather than building infrastructure. Um, and I wanted to see how, in a country generally without private business like Cuba, if their environmental policy would be different from that. And especially because Cuba now has such a burgeoning um, tourism industry. So here are some of the resources that I used for my project last semester. As you can see, it has a UNDP, the UN Human Development Report. A lot of these things are specific to Costa Rica, but some of them are more general and have some information about Cuba. And I looked at similar sources from studies about the impacts of tourism on the environment, which they have for Latin American and South American countries.